The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as my father-in-law's voice boomed through the Blackstone family's pristine dining room, each word designed to cut deeper than the last. "James has always been the disappointment of this family," Richard Blackstone declared, his steel-gray eyes fixed on my husband, with the kind of contempt usually reserved for insects. While his brothers built careers, he collected participation trophies. While they married accomplished women, he brought home. His gaze slid to me with practiced disdain. Well, we all know what he brought home. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap like the dutiful daughter-in-law I'd been for 3 years, watching my husband James shrink into his chair as if he could disappear entirely. His face had turned the shade of expensive burgundy wine, matching the vintage his father was currently savoring while delivering this public execution of his character. "Richard, please," my mother-in-law Margaret whispered, though her tone carried no real conviction. She'd stopped defending James years ago, around the time she'd decided that maintaining peace with her husband was more important than protecting her youngest son's dignity. "No, Margaret, someone needs to say it." Richard's voice grew louder, more theatrical, as he noticed he had the rapt attention of his other sons, Michael and David, along with their wives who watched the spectacle with barely concealed glee. "James works at a dead-end job, lives in a rental apartment because he can't manage to buy a house, and contributes nothing to this family's legacy. Nothing." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china, as someone, I think it was David's wife Sarah, tried to suppress a giggle. James stared at his untouched prime rib, as if it held the secrets of the universe, his shoulders hunched in defeat. "You know what the tragedy is?" Richard continued, warming to his theme like a conductor approaching the crescendo of a symphony. "My son only brings shame to this house. He deserves better." He paused for effect, letting his words sink into the assembled family like poison into fertile ground. "But more importantly, this family deserves better than him." The laughter started small, a snort from Michael, a barely contained chuckle from David, but it spread quickly around the table like wildfire, feeding on itself until even Margaret was hiding a smile behind her napkin. They laughed at James's expense, at his failures, at the pathetic picture he made sitting there in his off-the-rack suit while surrounded by his successful siblings in their designer clothes. I watched my husband's face crumble, watched 28 years of accumulated disappointment and rejection crystallize into something that looked dangerously close to acceptance. He was drowning in their laughter, suffocating on their casual cruelty, and not one person at that table seemed to care. That's when I made my decision. I set down my water glass with deliberate precision, the soft clink somehow cutting through the laughter like a knife through silk. The sound was small, insignificant, but it carried weight, the weight of finality, of lines being crossed that could never be uncrossed again. "You're absolutely right, sir," I said, my voice clear and calm and utterly serene. The laughter died instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Every eye at the table turned to me, their expressions ranging from surprise to confusion to something that might have been respect. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting agreement from the wife he'd just insulted by implication. Excuse me?" I smiled, the same pleasant smile I'd worn to every family dinner for 3 years, the same expression I'd perfected while enduring their subtle jabs and casual dismissals. "You're right," I repeated, my tone conversational, as if I were commenting on the weather. "James does deserve better, much better." James looked up at me with eyes full of hurt and confusion, and I felt my heart break a little for the man I'd married, the gentle, kind soul who'd never learned to fight back because he'd been taught from birth that he wasn't worth fighting for. But I was about to teach the Blackstone family a lesson they'd never forget. I was about to show them exactly what their shame had been sustaining all these years. "Well," Richard said, clearly pleased with my response, "at least someone in this family has some sense." He raised his wine glass in a mock toast. "To family honesty." The others raised their glasses too, still chuckling at James's expense, still basking in the warm glow of their collective superiority. They drank to honesty, these people who'd built their lives on appearances and pretensions, who measured worth in dollar signs and social standing. They had no idea that the quiet woman sitting at the foot of their table, the one they'd dismissed as a gold-digging nobody who'd somehow trapped their disappointing son, was about to dismantle their perfect world piece by piece. But they would learn. In exactly 2 days, they would learn that they'd made the gravest mistake of their privileged lives. They'd underestimated the wrong woman. The silence that followed my agreement stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, filled with the weight of unspoken expectations and shifting alliances. Richard Blackstone's weathered face broke into what might have been mistaken for a smile if you didn't know him well enough to recognize the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Finally," he said, setting down his wineglass with the satisfied air of a man who believed he'd just won a crucial battle. "Someone with the courage to speak the truth." He gestured toward me with the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of people. "Olivia understands what the rest of you seem incapable of grasping, that this family's reputation matters more than coddling feelings." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she reached for her napkin. "Richard, perhaps we should—" "No, Margaret." This needed to be said. He turned his attention fully to me, his expression almost paternal. "You know, Olivia, I misjudged you when James first brought you home. I thought you were just another pretty face looking for a meal ticket, but I see now that you have practical sense. You understand that sometimes love isn't enough." The irony was so thick I could taste it. Here was a man who'd spent 3 years treating me like an unwelcome intruder, suddenly praising me for agreeing that his son, my husband, was worthless. The other family members nodded along like bobblehead dolls, their expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to nervous anticipation of where this conversation might lead. "Love should be enough," I said quietly, my voice carrying just the right note of wistful sadness. "But you're right, sometimes practical considerations have to take precedence." I glanced at James, who was staring at me with the expression of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "I've learned a lot about practical considerations in the 3 years I've been part of this family." Michael, the eldest son and heir apparent to the Blackstone business empire, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of practical considerations?" His wife Amanda nodded encouragingly, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows raised in anticipation of gossip. I took a delicate sip of water, buying time to craft my response with surgical precision. "Well, for instance, I've learned that image is everything in your social circle. The right address, the right clothes, the right connections, they all matter more than character or kindness." "Exactly." Richard slammed his palm against the table, making the crystal glasses jump. "Image is credibility, and credibility is currency, something James has never understood." James flinched as if he'd been physically struck, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. I wanted to reach over and comfort him, to tell him that every word I was speaking was calculated to achieve a specific outcome, but he wouldn't understand. Not yet. He'd spent too many years believing their assessment of his worth to recognize a strategic retreat when he saw one. "The thing is," I continued, my tone growing more thoughtful, "I've also learned that sometimes the people who appear most successful on the surface are actually quite vulnerable underneath." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. David, the middle son who ran the family's real estate ventures, shifted in his seat. "What do you mean by vulnerable?" I smiled the same pleasant smile I'd been perfecting since I'd first walked into this house. "Oh, just that success can be fragile. It depends on so many factors. Market conditions, business relationships, reputation management." I paused to cut a small piece of my salmon, chewing thoughtfully. "Take your father's current deal with Morrison Industries, for example. Such an impressive contract. 12 months of negotiations, wasn't it? $1 million project that could really solidify Blackstone Construction's position in the commercial market." Richard straightened in his chair, his expression sharpening. "How do you know about Morrison Industries?" "James mentioned it," I said casually. "He was so proud that the family business was expanding into new territory. He talks about you all quite a bit, actually. Always hoping you'll include him in something important." The lie rolled off my tongue as smoothly as silk. James had never mentioned the Morrison deal because James was never included in business discussions. But Richard's ego was too large to question why his disappointing son might have shared family business secrets with his wife. "Yes, well," Richard cleared his throat, some of his earlier confidence evaporating. "The Morrison contract is confidential until it's finalized. Next week, actually." "Of course," I agreed readily. "I wouldn't dream of discussing it outside the family. After all, discretion is another one of those practical considerations, isn't it?" Margaret was watching me with new interest, her sharp blue eyes, so like James's, studying my face as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time. "You seem to have given this a lot of thought, dear." 3 years is a long time to observe and learn," I replied. "Long enough to understand how things really work in this family. Long enough to appreciate the delicate balance that keeps everything functioning." The word delicate hung in the air like a small threat, though I delivered it with the same mild tone I'd used to comment on the flower arrangements. But I could see that Richard had heard the undertone, the subtle suggestion that the empire he'd built might not be as solid as it appeared. "Balance," he repeated slowly. "Exactly. The balance between appearance and reality. between what people think they know and what's actually true. I met his gaze directly, letting him see something steely underneath my pleasant exterior. It's fascinating how quickly that balance can shift when the right pressure is applied in the right place. For just a moment, Richard Blackstone, the man who'd built a construction empire from nothing, who commanded respect in boardrooms across the city, looked uncertain, as if he were suddenly questioning whether the mousy woman he'd dismissed for 3 years might actually pose some kind of threat. Then the moment passed, and his arrogance reasserted itself. "Well," he said with forced joviality, "I'm glad we could have this frank discussion. It's refreshing to have someone in the family who understands reality." "Reality," I agreed, raising my water glass in a small toast. To understanding reality. They drank to that, all of them, while I sat quietly and began the mental countdown. 48 hours until Richard Blackstone learned what reality actually looked like. The drive home from the Blackstone family dinner passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of tires against asphalt and the occasional sniffle from James as he tried to process what had just happened. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the steering wheel of our modest Honda Civic, a car that had become a source of shame for him every time we pulled up to his family's circular driveway behind his brother's BMWs and Mercedes. "Why?" The word escaped him like a sob, raw and broken. "Why did you agree with him?" I wanted to explain, but explanations would have to wait. For now, I needed James to believe what his family believed, that I was simply being practical, perhaps even preparing to leave him for someone more successful. The performance had to be flawless, even in private, because in a family like the Blackstones, private conversations had a way of becoming public knowledge. "Because he was right," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough resignation to be convincing. "You do deserve better than what you have." "What I have?" He turned toward me, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights. "Olivia, what I have is you. That's all I've ever wanted." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke my resolve. This was the James I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. The gentle giant who worked as a high school history teacher because he genuinely cared about making a difference, who volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, who brought me wildflowers from the roadside because he knew I preferred them to expensive arrangements from florists. But it was also the James who'd been systematically crushed by his family's expectations, who'd internalized their disappointment until it became his own self-loathing, the man who apologized for his existence every time we attended a family function, who made himself smaller and smaller trying to avoid his father's attention. "You deserve a wife who can give you the life your family thinks you should have," I continued, hating every word but knowing they were necessary. "Someone with connections, with family money, with the kind of background that opens doors instead of slamming them shut. I don't care about any of that." His voice cracked with emotion. "Olivia, I love you. I've loved you since that first day you walked into my classroom looking for the lost and found." I remembered that day perfectly. I'd been 25, working as a substitute teacher while I figured out my next move, and I'd wandered into James Blackstone's classroom after school hours searching for a student's missing textbook. He'd been grading papers, his sleeves rolled up, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 25 years. What had struck me first wasn't his good looks, though he was undeniably handsome in that understated way that suggested good genetics rather than expensive grooming. It was the way he'd immediately stopped what he was doing to help me, the genuine concern in his eyes as he'd searched every corner of his classroom for a book that ultimately hadn't even been missing. "I found it," I'd told him, holding up the textbook I'd discovered in my own bag. "I'm an idiot. Sorry for bothering you." "You're not an idiot," he'd said with such conviction that I'd actually believed him. "And you're not bothering me. I'm James, by the way, James Blackstone." The name should have meant something to me. The Blackstones were well known in our city, their construction company responsible for half the commercial buildings downtown. But I'd been new to the area, focused on my own complicated situation, and the significance of his family name had completely escaped me. "Olivia Chen," I'd replied, and we'd shaken hands like civilized adults while something electric passed between us that had nothing to do with civilization. 6 months later, I'd moved in with him. A year after that, he'd proposed with his grandmother's ring and a speech about how he couldn't imagine his life without me. The wedding had been small, my choice, with just immediate family and close friends. I'd thought it was romantic at the time, intimate and meaningful. Now I realized I'd simply made it easier for his family to pretend I didn't exist. "When we got married," James said quietly, pulling me back to the present, "you promised me it would be us against the world. Remember? You said we were a team." "We were a team when I thought the world was the problem," I replied, the words tasting like ash. "But James, what if the problem is us? What if your father is right, and we're just Not compatible with the life you were meant to have? He was crying now, silent tears that tracked down his cheeks in the glow of the dashboard lights. James had always been an emotional person, sensitive in a way that his family interpreted as weakness, but that I'd always seen as strength. It took courage to remain soft in a world that rewarded hardness, to keep caring when caring brought nothing but pain. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "Olivia, please. Whatever I've done wrong, whatever I need to change, it's not about what you've done wrong." I pulled into our apartment complex parking lot, the modest buildings looking even more shabby after an evening in his family's mansion. "It's about what we can't change. Your family will never accept me, and I'm tired of pretending that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They don't matter. They matter to you." I turned off the engine and faced him fully. "Every family dinner, every holiday, every casual comment, they all matter to you because you're still trying to earn their approval. And I'm tired of watching you shrink a little more each time they remind you that you're not enough. So what are you saying?" I looked at this man I'd married, this good and decent person who deserved so much better than the family he'd been born into, and the wife who was about to deceive him in service of a larger truth. "I'm saying that maybe your father was right about one thing," I said softly. "Maybe it is time for both of us to want something better." As we walked up to our apartment in silence, James carrying the weight of what felt like impending abandonment, I began the mental preparation for phase 2 of my plan. The Blackstone family thought they knew who I was. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. The next morning, I sat in my home office, a converted bedroom in our modest 2-bedroom apartment, surrounded by files, photographs, and newspaper clippings that told the real story of the Blackstone family empire. James had left early for school, his eyes still red from crying, believing that his wife was planning to abandon him just like everyone else in his life eventually did. If only he knew that I was actually preparing to burn his family's world to the ground in order to save him from it. The Blackstone Construction Company had been built on a foundation of strategic partnerships, political connections, and what charitable observers might call aggressive business practices. Richard Blackstone had started with nothing 40 years ago, a fact he never let anyone forget, and had systematically bought, bullied, and blackmailed his way into becoming one of the city's most influential developers. The Morrison Industries contract was his crown jewel, a $1 million deal to build 3 commercial complexes that would cement Blackstone Construction's reputation as a major player in large-scale development. 12 months of negotiations, countless dinners with Morrison executives, and enough legal wrangling to bankrupt a small country. The signing was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. What Richard didn't know, what none of the Blackstone family knew, was that I'd been tracking their business dealings for 3 years, ever since it became clear that they would never accept me as anything more than an unwelcome intruder in their perfect dynasty. My laptop screen displayed the organizational chart I'd painstakingly constructed over months of careful research. At the top sat Richard Blackstone, the family patriarch who ruled his empire with an iron fist wrapped in expensive leather gloves. Below him were his 3 sons, each carved into the family business like pieces on a chessboard. Michael, the eldest at 32, handled the financial side of operations. MBA from Wharton, married to Amanda Fitzpatrick, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Michael was smart, ruthless, and completely devoted to maintaining the family's image of success. He was also, according to my research, skimming money from project budgets to fund his gambling addiction, a vice that had already cost him nearly $200,000 in the past year. David, the middle son at 30, ran the real estate acquisition division. He specialized in identifying undervalued properties and finding ways to convince their owners to sell, often through methods that skirted the edges of legal intimidation. David's wife Sarah came from old money, which gave the family access to social circles that opened doors to lucrative contracts. What Sarah didn't know was that David had been having an affair with his assistant for 6 months. Then there was James, the youngest at 28, who'd been systematically excluded from the family business because he'd chosen teaching over construction, compassion over cutthroat competition, the disappointment, the failure, the shame of the Blackstone legacy. Except James wasn't the shame of the family. He was the only one with actual integrity. My research had revealed that the Blackstone empire was built on a house of cards, held together by carefully maintained relationships, and the kind of reputation management that cost a fortune to sustain. They were successful, certainly, but their success was fragile in ways that Richard's arrogance prevented him from seeing. The Morrison Industries deal, for instance, had only come about because of Morrison's relationship with the City Planning Commission, a relationship that Richard had cultivated through a combination of political donations and what amounted to legalized bribery. The commission members who'd approved Morrison's zoning requests had received substantial consulting fees from Blackstone Construction over the past 2 years. But Morrison Industries itself was a different kind of company entirely. They prided themselves on ethical business practices, environmental responsibility, and what their CEO called stakeholder capitalism, the idea that businesses should serve all their constituents, not just their shareholders. Their reputation was built on transparency and integrity, values that would be severely compromised if they discovered their new construction partner had a history of questionable practices. I opened another file on my computer, this one containing correspondence I'd carefully preserved from my previous life, the life that the Blackstone family knew nothing about. Letters on official letterhead, email chains discussing multi-million-dollar investments, board meeting minutes that mentioned my name with the kind of respect that money and influence commanded. You see, the Blackstone family had made one crucial error in their assessment of me. They'd assumed that a woman working as a substitute teacher, driving a Honda Civic, and living in a rental apartment must be exactly what she appeared to be, a gold digger who'd somehow trapped their disappointing son. They'd never bothered to ask why a woman with my background was working as a substitute teacher in the first place. The truth was complicated, painful, and completely invisible to people who measured worth in dollar signs and social status. 3 years ago, I'd walked away from a life of privilege that made the Blackstone fortune look like pocket change. I'd given up a trust fund worth $50 million, a position on 3 corporate boards, and a family legacy that stretched back 4 generations, all because I'd discovered that my family's wealth was built on the same kind of moral compromises that the Blackstones specialized in. I'd chosen love over money, integrity over influence, and the chance to build something real with James over the hollow existence of inherited privilege. I'd thought I was escaping the toxic world of family dynasties and business empires. Instead, I'd married into a different version of the same poison. But unlike the naive young woman who'd fled from her family's corruption 3 years ago, I now understood that sometimes you couldn't escape a corrupted system. You had to destroy it from within. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. It had been months since I'd used it, but I knew the person on the other end would remember me. Morrison Industries, CEO's office. This is Jennifer speaking. Jennifer, this is Olivia Chen. I need to speak with Marcus Morrison as soon as possible. Ms. Chen? Jennifer's voice brightened with recognition. Of course. Let me put you right through. He'll be so pleased to hear from you. As the phone rang, transferring me to one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, a man who owed his current position partly to recommendations I'd made years ago when I still moved in those circles, I allowed myself a small smile. The Blackstone family was about to learn that their greatest shame had been sustaining them all along, and tomorrow, that sustenance was going to be cut off permanently. The conversation with Marcus Morrison lasted exactly 18 minutes and accomplished everything I'd hoped for. By the time I hung up the phone, the first domino in the Blackstone Empire's collapse was already wobbling, ready to fall with the gentlest push. Olivia Chen, Marcus had said, after Jennifer transferred me through, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. I was wondering if I'd ever hear from you again. How's the teaching life treating you? Marcus Morrison was one of the few people from my previous life who'd understood my decision to walk away from the family empire. He'd built Morrison Industries from the ground up, earning his success rather than inheriting it, and he'd always respected people who chose principle over profit. When I'd disappeared from the Boston social scene 3 years ago, he'd been one of the only ones who hadn't asked intrusive questions about my reasons. It's been educational, I'd replied, which made him laugh. Marcus, I'm calling because I need a favor, and I need you to trust me without asking too many questions. After what you did for me during the Riverside development deal, you could ask me to donate my kidney and I'd consider it. His tone grew more serious. What do you need? Information about your upcoming contract signing with Blackstone Construction. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. That's oddly specific. Mind telling me why you're interested in Richard Blackstone's business deals? Because I married his son, and I need to know exactly what kind of man I'm dealing with. Another pause, this one laden with implications. Olivia, please tell me you didn't marry into the Blackstone family without researching them first. I researched the man I was marrying, not his business practices. There's a difference. I took a breath, preparing to reveal more than I'd intended. Marcus, James Blackstone is nothing like his father. He's a good man who chose teaching over the family business because he has actual morals. But his family treats him like dirt, and I'm tired of watching them destroy his self-worth while they profit from practices that would make you sick, such as bribery, intimidation, tax evasion, environmental violations that get covered up through political connections. Should I continue? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him thinking. Morrison Industries had spent years building a reputation for ethical business practices, and any association with corruption could devastate their brand. You have proof of these allegations? I have 3 years' worth of documentation. Bank records, email correspondence, recorded conversations, witness statements, everything you'd need to make an informed decision about whether you want your company associated with the Blackstone name. Send me what you have. I'll review it and make my own determination about the contract. Marcus, the signing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Then you'd better send me those files quickly. After ending the call, I spent the next 4 hours compiling a comprehensive dossier of Blackstone Construction's questionable practices. Every document was legitimate, obtained through legal means during my 3 years of careful observation. I'd learned early in my marriage that the Blackstone family treated their home like a boardroom, discussing business matters freely in front of the wife they considered too insignificant to pose any threat. They'd talked about bribing city officials over Sunday dinner, discussed environmental shortcuts over holiday cocktails, bragged about intimidating property owners over birthday celebrations, all while I sat quietly, smiled pleasantly, and memorized every damning detail. By 2 p.m., I'd sent Marcus a file containing enough evidence to destroy the Blackstone empire 10 times over, but I wasn't interested in total destruction. I wanted precision. The Morrison contract would disappear, taking with it the $1 million deal that represented Richard's expansion into major commercial development. The family's reputation would suffer, their political connections would start distancing themselves, and their carefully maintained image of success would develop some very public cracks, but they'd survive, wounded, diminished, humbled, but alive. Unlike what they'd been systematically doing to James for his entire life. My phone rang just as I was closing my laptop. James's number appeared on the screen, and I felt the familiar pang of guilt that had been my constant companion since last night's dinner. "Hi," I answered, trying to sound normal, despite the fact that I'd just spent the morning orchestrating his family's downfall. "Hey." His voice was subdued, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the day teaching American history, while wondering if his marriage was about to become history as well. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," I said, which was technically true. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I think I may have been more emotional than rational." Hope crept into his voice. "Really? Really? James, I love you. That hasn't changed. But I also think we need to have some serious conversations about our future, about what we both want from this life. I want you. That's all I've ever wanted." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke my heart. Here was a man who'd been told his entire life that he wasn't enough, that his dreams were too small, his ambitions too modest, his very existence a disappointment to the family name. And yet he'd somehow maintained the capacity to love unconditionally, to find joy in simple things, to believe that a quiet life built on genuine affection was worth more than all the success and status his family worshipped. "I want you too," I told him, "but I also want you to be happy. Really happy, not just settled for whatever scraps of approval your family throws your way. I am happy with you. Are you? Or are you just used to disappointment?" He was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore. The honesty in that admission nearly made me cry. This was what the Blackstone family had done to him, convinced him that disappointment was his natural state, that wanting more was selfish and unrealistic. "James, what would you do if money weren't an issue? If you didn't have to worry about your family's expectations or their approval, what would make you genuinely happy?" "I'd teach," he said without hesitation, "but in a better school, with better resources. Maybe start a program for at-risk kids, help them see that they have value regardless of what their families or society tells them." He paused. Crazy, right? A 28-year-old man who still dreams about saving the world through education. It's not crazy at all. It's beautiful. You really think so? I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Tomorrow, when his family's world started crumbling around them, James would finally understand that he'd never been the shame of the Blackstone family. He'd been their salvation, the only one among them with an actual soul. That evening, while James graded papers in our small living room, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began the delicate process of covering my tracks. The files I'd sent to Marcus Morrison were damning enough to destroy the Blackstone construction contract, but I needed to ensure that when the inevitable investigation began, nothing could be traced back to me. The beauty of having spent 3 years as the invisible wife was that nobody in the Blackstone family had ever considered me capable of sophisticated corporate espionage. They'd dismissed me as a gold-digging teacher who'd somehow ensnared their disappointing son. never bothering to ask why a woman with my educational background, Harvard MBA, summa cum laude, was working as a substitute teacher in a public school system. The answer, of course, was complicated. 3 years ago, I'd been Olivia Hartwell, heir to a pharmaceutical empire built on patents that had saved millions of lives and generated billions in revenue. The Hartwell Foundation funded hospitals, universities, and research initiatives across 3 continents. Our family name appeared on buildings, in medical journals, and in the acknowledgments of Nobel Prize acceptance speeches. I'd also discovered that our fortune was built on systematically suppressing generic drug research, bribing FDA officials, and maintaining artificial scarcity of life-saving medications to maximize profit margins. The same patents that had made us heroes to some had made us villains to others. The parents who watched their children die because they couldn't afford insulin, the elderly who chose between medication and food, the developing nations that were denied access to treatments that could have prevented countless deaths. When I'd confronted my father about these practices, he'd given me the same speech that Richard Blackstone had given his family last night, that business was business, that sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford, that our comfortable lifestyle depended on making hard choices that others wouldn't understand. So I'd made a hard choice he didn't understand. I'd walked away from $50 million, changed my last name from Hartwell to my mother's maiden name of Chen, and disappeared into a life of intentional anonymity. The trust fund remained untouched, generating interest in accounts I never accessed. The board positions were quietly resigned. The social connections were severed without explanation. I'd thought I was free. But 3 years of marriage to James had taught me that you can't escape corruption by ignoring it. You can only stop it by fighting it. And sometimes fighting required using the very weapons you'd tried to abandon. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Files received. Meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow to review. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. M. Marcus was moving faster than I'd expected. The Blackstone contract signing was scheduled for 2 p.m. tomorrow, which meant he'd have exactly 6 hours to review the evidence and make his decision. It would be cutting it close, but Marcus Morrison hadn't built his company by avoiding difficult choices under pressure. I was closing my laptop when I heard James's voice from the living room, talking on his phone with someone. His tone was different, more animated than I'd heard him in months. That's incredible, Sarah. When did you find out? A pause. No, I'm genuinely happy for you both. David must be thrilled. Sarah, David's wife, calling with news that had James congratulating them. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I realized what this might mean for my timeline. Of course we'll be there, James continued. Olivia loves family celebrations. We wouldn't miss it. He hung up and turned toward me, his face brighter than it had been since last night's disaster. Sarah's pregnant. They just found out today, and they want to have a celebration dinner tomorrow night to share the news with everyone. My heart sank. A family dinner tomorrow night, just hours after the Morrison deal would either be signed or canceled. If Marcus Morrison decided to pull out of the contract, the Blackstone family would be in crisis mode, looking for someone to blame. They'd be scrutinizing every family member, every business associate, every possible source of the leak that had cost them their biggest contract, and I'd be sitting at their dinner table, smiling and pretending to celebrate while they dissected their failure and planned their revenge. That's wonderful news, I managed, hoping my voice sounded more enthusiastic than it felt. When's the dinner? 7 o'clock tomorrow. At the house, of course. James's expression grew more tentative. Unless you'd rather not go, given everything. I couldn't avoid the dinner without arousing suspicion, and truthfully, I wanted to be there when Richard Blackstone learned that his empire was more fragile than he'd believed. I wanted to see his face when he realized that someone had outmaneuvered him, that his carefully constructed world of intimidation and bribery had finally collapsed under its own weight. No, we should definitely be there, I said. Family is important, right? James's relief was visible. Are you sure? I know last night was difficult. Last night was a wake-up call, but maybe that's what we both needed. I spent the rest of the evening researching pregnancy announcements and baby shower traditions, preparing to play the role of the supportive sister-in-law, while internally counting down the hours until the Morrison Industries bombshell exploded in the Blackstone family's faces. At midnight, I received an encrypted email from Marcus Morrison. The subject line was simple: contract review complete. The message inside was even simpler: meeting canceled. All future business suspended pending investigation. You were right about everything. M.E. It was done. The $1 million Morrison Industries contract was dead, taking with it Richard Blackstone's expansion plans and a significant portion of his company's projected revenue. By morning, word would spread through the construction industry that Morrison had pulled out of their biggest partnership, raising questions about Blackstone Construction's business practices and reliability. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd planned, but as I lay in bed next to James, listening to his peaceful breathing while he slept the sleep of the innocent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just set in motion something that would destroy more than I'd intended. The Blackstone family had hurt James for years, with their casual cruelty and systematic rejection. Tomorrow, I was going to hurt them back. The question was whether James would ever forgive me for it. The call came at 8:47 a.m., just as James was leaving for school, and I was pretending to prepare for another day of substitute teaching. Richard Blackstone's voice thundered through the phone with the barely controlled rage of a man who just watched his empire crack down the middle. "James, I need you at the office. Now." I could hear the panic underneath the fury, the desperation of someone who'd spent the morning trying to salvage a deal that had already slipped through his fingers like water. James looked at me with confusion, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Dad? What's wrong?" "I have classes today. Cancel them. This is a family emergency." The line went dead, leaving James staring at his phone with the expression of someone who'd just been conscripted into a war he didn't understand. "What do you think that was about?" he asked, reaching for his jacket with the automatic compliance of someone who'd spent 30 years following orders without question. I shrugged, channeling the perfect performance of a wife who knew nothing about corporate machinations. "Maybe one of the projects hit a snag. You know how your father gets when things don't go according to plan." He sounded different, scared almost. James paused at the door, his hand on the doorknob. "I can't remember the last time he asked me to come to the office for anything. Maybe he's finally realizing he needs all hands on deck," I said, kissing his cheek with the tenderness of someone sending her husband off to unwittingly participate in the family drama she'd orchestrated. "Call me later and let me know what's happening." After he left, I waited exactly 30 minutes before driving to the coffee shop 3 blocks from Blackstone Construction's downtown headquarters. It was the kind of generic corporate cafe that catered to office workers who needed caffeine and Wi-Fi, perfectly anonymous and positioned with a clear view of the building where Richard Blackstone was currently discovering that his $1 million deal had evaporated overnight. I ordered a latte and chose a table by the window, opening my laptop and pretending to work on lesson plans while actually monitoring the local business news for any mention of the Morrison Industries contract cancellation. At 10:15 a.m., the first story appeared on the construction industry website I'd been refreshing compulsively. The headline was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Morrison Industries cancels major construction partnership over ethics concerns. The article was brief but devastating. Morrison Industries, the commercial development giant known for its commitment to ethical business practices, announced this morning the cancellation of a $1.2 million construction contract with Blackstone Construction. The partnership, which would have involved building 3 commercial complexes over the next 18 months, was terminated following what Morrison CEO Marcus Morrison called serious concerns about our potential partners' business practices and corporate culture. Morrison Industries has built its reputation on transparency, integrity, and responsible business practices, Morrison said in a statement released this morning. "After careful review, we have determined that this partnership does not align with our company values or our commitment to ethical development." Blackstone Construction CEO Richard Blackstone was not available for comment. I felt a flutter of satisfaction reading those words. Marcus had been elegant in his destruction, giving no specific details that could lead to lawsuits while making it clear that Blackstone Construction had failed some kind of ethical review. In the construction industry, where reputation was everything and corporate partnerships were built on trust, this kind of public rejection was devastating. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dad's losing his mind. Deal fell through. Emergency family meeting at 2 p.m. Not sure when I'll be home." I typed back, "I'm so sorry. What happened?" "Don't know yet. He's locked in his office making phone calls. Michael and David are here too. First time they've all wanted me involved in something." The irony was perfect. After years of excluding James from family business, they were suddenly desperate enough to include him in their crisis management. He was probably sitting in their conference room right now, listening to his father rage about incompetent lawyers and vindictive competitors, completely unaware that his wife was the architect of their downfall. At 11:30, I drove past the Blackstone Construction building and saw exactly what I'd expected. A parking lot full of expensive cars belonging to lawyers, accountants, and crisis management consultants. Through the windows, I could see people in expensive suits gesturing animatedly, probably trying to figure out how to contain the damage and salvage their reputation. Too late for that. By noon, 2 more articles had appeared online. One was a deeper dive into Morrison Industries' decision-making process, quoting anonymous sources who suggested that the cancellation was based on extensive documentation of questionable business practices spanning several years. The other was a broader piece about the importance of due diligence in corporate partnerships, using the Morrison-Blackstone situation as a cautionary tale. The construction industry was a small world, and news traveled fast. By the end of the day, every major developer in the city would know that Morrison Industries had rejected Blackstone Construction for ethical reasons. Other potential partners would start asking questions, conducting their own reviews, distancing themselves from any association with scandal. Richard Blackstone had built his empire on relationships and reputation. I'd just poisoned both. At 3 p.m., James texted again, "Still here. Dad wants the whole family at dinner tonight to present a united front. Sarah's pregnancy announcement is being postponed. Mom's crying. Never seen them this scared. Margaret crying." The image struck me as oddly humanizing. This woman who'd sat silently while her husband destroyed her youngest son's self-worth was apparently capable of genuine emotion when her own comfort was threatened. "Do you need me to do anything?" I texted back. "Just be there tonight. Whatever's happening, I have a feeling we're going to need each other more than ever." If he only knew how right he was. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what would essentially be my performance review, a dinner where I'd have to sit across from people I'd just wounded and convince them that I was still the harmless, insignificant wife they'd always believed me to be. The Blackstone family thought they were gathering to discuss damage control and crisis management. They had no idea they were about to sit down with the person who'd caused the crisis in the first place. The Blackstone mansion felt like a mausoleum when James and I arrived at 6:30 that evening, 15 minutes early because James was nervous about being late to what his father had termed the most important family meeting in company history. The usual warmth and light that typically emanated from the house during family gatherings had been replaced by something colder, more clinical, the atmosphere of a war room preparing for battle. Margaret answered the door herself, which immediately told me how serious the situation had become. The Blackstones employed a housekeeper who normally handled such mundane tasks, but apparently the family was now concerned about maintaining privacy around their staff. Margaret's face was pale and drawn, her usually perfect makeup unable to conceal the stress lines that had appeared around her eyes since this morning. "Thank you for coming," she said, embracing James with the desperate intensity of someone clinging to a life preserver. Her gaze, when it turned to me, was different than usual, not the polite dismissal I was accustomed to, but something approaching genuine need. "We're so glad you're both here." The living room had been transformed into a makeshift crisis center. Documents covered every surface, laptops were open on multiple tables, and several men in expensive suits, lawyers and consultants from the look of them, were huddled in intense conversation near the fireplace. Richard stood at the head of the room like a general addressing his troops, his face flushed with the combination of anger and panic that comes from watching a carefully constructed empire begin to crumble. "James, Olivia," he said when he saw us, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had been present during last night's character assassination. "Thank you for being here. We need all family members present for what we're about to discuss." Michael and David were seated at opposite ends of the sofa, their wives flanking them like bodyguards. Amanda looked shell-shocked, her designer handbag clutched in her lap, as if it contained everything of value she still possessed. Sarah appeared to be fighting back tears, her hands protectively covering her still flat stomach, where the child she'd wanted to announce tonight was growing in blissful ignorance of the family chaos surrounding its impending arrival. "What exactly happened?" James asked, taking a seat in one of the armchairs and pulling me down beside him. "I know the Morrison deal fell through, but—" "It didn't fall through," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "It was sabotaged. Someone deliberately provided Morrison Industries with information designed to make us look like criminals." My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression neutral. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the beginning of their investigation into who had betrayed them. I needed to be perfect in my performance of shocked innocence. "What kind of information?" I asked, allowing just the right amount of concern to color my voice. One of the lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, answered before Richard could speak. "Financial records, correspondence between company executives and city officials, documentation of what Morrison's people are calling ethically questionable business practices." "But that's impossible," James said, his loyalty to his family temporarily overriding his usual deference. "Dad, your company has always operated above board. Everyone knows that." The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Michael and David exchanged glances that spoke volumes about just how above board their operations actually were. while Richard's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous shade of burgundy. "James," he said carefully, "there are aspects of business operations that require a certain flexibility in interpretation. Practices that are completely legal, but might be misunderstood by outsiders who don't appreciate the complexities of commercial development." Translation: We've been skating on the edge of legality for years, and someone just provided evidence to prove it. The question, another lawyer said, is who had access to this information and why they chose to share it with Morrison Industries specifically. Richard began pacing in front of the fireplace, his movements sharp and predatory. Someone with intimate knowledge of our operations. Someone who's been watching us, collecting evidence, building a case against us. Could it be a competitor? Amanda suggested hopefully. Someone trying to steal the Morrison contract for themselves? Morrison canceled all construction partnerships pending a complete review of their vendor relationships, Michael said grimly. This wasn't about stealing our contract. This was about destroying our reputation. Which brings us back to the original question, Richard said, his gaze sweeping across his family with the intensity of a searchlight. Who did this to us? The paranoia in the room was palpable. I could see each family member mentally reviewing their recent interactions, wondering who among their friends, business associates, or employees might have betrayed them. They were so focused on looking outward for threats that it never occurred to them to look inward, at the quiet wife sitting in their living room, nodding sympathetically while they dissected their own downfall. "There's something else," David said quietly. "Something we haven't told you yet." Richard stopped pacing. "What?" 3 other potential partners have called today asking to postpone their upcoming meetings with us. Henderson Development, Riverside Construction, Premier Commercial, all citing schedule conflicts, but the timing is too convenient to be coincidental. The room went silent, except for the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. I felt a flutter of surprise. I'd expected the Morrison cancellation to have ripple effects, but not this quickly or extensively. They're all part of the same business network as Morrison Industries, one of the lawyers explained. Word travels fast in commercial development circles. If Morrison pulled out over ethical concerns, other companies are going to distance themselves until they can assess the situation. "How much is this going to cost us?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Potentially everything," Richard said bluntly. The Morrison contract was supposed to be our entry point into major commercial development. Without it, and without the other partnerships, we're looking at a revenue shortfall of at least $3 million over the next 18 months. James reached for my hand, squeezing it tight as he absorbed the magnitude of his family's crisis. He was probably feeling guilty for not being more involved in the business, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent this disaster. If he only knew that the woman sitting beside him, the wife he'd been ready to lose just 24 hours ago, was the one who'd orchestrated the entire collapse. "We'll find out who did this," Richard said, his voice carrying the promise of retribution. "And when we do, they're going to pay for what they've cost this family." I met his gaze directly, letting him see nothing but supportive concern. After all, I was just the insignificant daughter-in-law who'd agreed that James was a disappointment. What threat could I possibly pose? The family meeting stretched past midnight, fueled by caffeine, desperation, and the kind of family dysfunction that only emerges when money and reputation are on the line. I'd spent 6 hours listening to the Blackstone clan dissect their business relationships, analyze their enemies, and construct increasingly paranoid theories about who might have betrayed them to Morrison Industries. Through it all, I'd maintained the perfect performance of the concerned daughter-in-law, offering coffee, asking innocent questions, and providing exactly the kind of supportive background presence that made me invisible. They were so focused on external threats that none of them questioned whether the enemy might already be inside their carefully guarded circle. By the time James and I finally left the mansion, I was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain my facade. James was quiet during the drive home, processing the evening's revelations about his family's business practices and the precarious nature of their financial situation. "I never knew," he said as we pulled into our apartment complex parking lot. "About the bribes, the intimidation, the shortcuts they've been taking for years. I always thought Dad was just aggressive in business, not actually corrupt." I turned off the engine and studied his profile in the dim light from the parking lot fixtures. "How do you feel about it?" "Sick, ashamed, relieved that I never got involved in any of it." He looked at me with an expression of raw vulnerability. "Is it terrible that part of me is almost glad this happened? That maybe now they'll have to change the way they do business?" "It's not terrible at all," I said softly. "It's human. But they're still my family, and whoever did this to them knew exactly how to hurt them most effectively. They targeted the Morrison deal specifically because it was Dad's biggest expansion opportunity. They understood our business well enough to provide documentation that would scare off other potential partners. This wasn't random corporate sabotage. This was personal. My chest tightened with guilt. James was right. What I'd done was deeply personal. I'd systematically analyzed his family's weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. I'd justified it as justice, as protecting James from their toxic influence, as giving them a taste of the humiliation they'd been serving him for years. But looking at his face now, seeing the genuine pain he felt over his family's downfall, I wondered if I'd gone too far. "James," I began, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I'd single-handedly destroyed his family's business empire because his father had called him a disappointment? That I'd weaponized my previous life's connections to teach them a lesson about respect? "What is it?" he asked, noticing my hesitation. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but something about the timing made me answer anyway. "Olivia Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "Who is this?" "My name is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Financial Crimes Unit. I'm calling because we've received some interesting information about your family's business activities, and I was hoping we could schedule a time to talk." My blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry. What family business activities? I don't understand." "Mrs. Chen, we know about the files you sent to Morrison Industries. We know about your previous identity as Olivia Hartwell, and we know about the systematic documentation you've been conducting of Blackstone Construction's illegal activities over the past 3 years. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. James was staring at me with growing alarm, able to hear the detective's voice through the phone speaker. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I managed. "Ma'am, we have bank records showing transfers from Hartwell Foundation accounts to pay for private investigators. We have testimony from those investigators about the surveillance work you commissioned on your husband's family. We have digital forensics proving that the files sent to Morrison Industries originated from your laptop." "Olivia?" James's voice was barely a whisper. "What is she talking about?" Detective Martinez continued, relentless in her methodical destruction of my carefully constructed cover story. "Mrs. Chen, the Blackstone family has filed a formal complaint alleging corporate espionage, theft of proprietary information, and intentional interference with business relationships. They're claiming damages in excess of $5 million. "That's impossible," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "I'm a substitute teacher. I don't know anything about corporate espionage. Ma'am, you're the heir to a $50 million pharmaceutical fortune. You have an MBA from Harvard Business School. You've served on 3 corporate boards and have connections throughout the business community that most people would kill for. You're many things, but naive isn't one of them." James was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, his face cycling through confusion, betrayal, and something that looked like dawning horror. "Who are you?" he whispered. The question hung in the air between us like a blade. 3 years of marriage, of building a life together, of sharing dreams and fears and quiet moments, all of it suddenly thrown into question by the revelation that I'd been living under a false identity. "James, I can explain. You're Olivia Hartwell," he said, his voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "The pharmaceutical heiress who disappeared from Boston society 3 years ago. I remember reading about it in the papers. The daughter of the Hartwell empire who gave up billions of dollars and vanished without explanation." Detective Martinez was still talking through the phone, explaining legal procedures and requesting cooperation. But I barely heard her. My entire world was collapsing around me as I watched the man I loved realize that our entire relationship was built on lies. "You destroyed my family," James said, his voice hollow with shock. "You sat in their living room tonight, held my hand while they panicked about losing everything, and you're the one who caused it all." "James, please let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for 3 years? That you married me under a false name? That you systematically destroyed my family's business while pretending to be a harmless substitute teacher?" "I did it for you," I said desperately. "James, they were destroying you piece by piece. Every family dinner, every casual insult, every reminder that you weren't good enough, I couldn't stand watching them tear you apart, so you tore them apart instead." The pain in his voice was unbearable. I'd thought I was protecting him, saving him from his family's toxic influence. Instead, I'd revealed myself to be just another manipulator in his life, someone else who'd lied to him for what I'd convinced myself were noble reasons. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Martinez's voice cut through our confrontation, "I'm going to need you to come to the station tomorrow morning for questioning. This investigation is just beginning." As I hung up the phone, James was already getting out of the car, his movements mechanical and distant. "Where are you going?" I called after him. "I don't know," he said without turning around. "Anywhere but here." I sat alone in our car, watching the man I'd married walk away from me into the darkness, and realized that in trying to save him from his family's cruelty, I'd become something far worse. I'd become their enemy, and now I'd lost everything that mattered. 3 weeks after my world imploded in a parking lot confession, I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the terms of my divorce settlement, while simultaneously preparing for what would likely be the most expensive corporate lawsuit in the city's history. James had filed for divorce within 48 hours of learning my true identity, citing fraud, deception, and irreconcilable differences in papers that had been delivered to my temporary hotel residence by a process server who'd looked almost apologetic. The Blackstone family had moved with military precision once Detective Martinez's investigation had confirmed their suspicions. Richard had hired the most aggressive litigation firm in the state, launched a public relations campaign painting me as a vindictive corporate spy, and filed civil lawsuits seeking damages that would have been laughable if they weren't potentially bankrupting. But they'd made one crucial error in their rush to destroy me. They'd underestimated exactly how much evidence I'd gathered during my 3 years of marriage. "Olivia," my attorney David Sterling said, closing the thick folder that contained the Blackstone family's latest legal filings. "They're asking for $12 million in damages. Corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, intentional interference with business relationships, conspiracy to commit fraud. They've essentially accused you of every business crime short of embezzlement. Can they prove any of it?" I asked, though we both knew the answer. "Some of it, yes. You did provide confidential information to Morrison Industries. You did use your business connections to damage their reputation. You did systematically collect evidence of their illegal activities over several years." David leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "The question is whether what you did was criminal or simply extremely effective whistleblowing." I'd spent the past 3 weeks reviewing my options, and the picture wasn't encouraging. The evidence against me was substantial: bank records, digital forensics, witness testimony from the private investigators I'd hired. The Blackstone family had built an airtight case proving that I'd deliberately sabotaged their business relationships and cost them millions in lost revenue. What they hadn't anticipated was that I'd built an even more comprehensive case, proving that they'd been operating as an organized criminal enterprise for over a decade. "David, I need you to arrange a meeting with Richard Blackstone and his legal team. Tell them I'm prepared to make a settlement offer." "What kind of settlement?" "Olivia, even with your trust fund, $12 million would..." "Not that kind of settlement." I opened my own folder, revealing documents that represented 3 years of careful investigation and the kind of evidence that could put people in federal prison. "Tell them I'm prepared to make this all go away, but only if they agree to my terms." "What terms?" I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a message I'd been crafting in my mind since the night James walked away from me in that parking lot. The night I realized that sometimes winning required accepting the cost of victory. First, they drop all civil lawsuits against me immediately. Second, they issue a public statement acknowledging that their business practices were under review and that they're implementing new ethical guidelines. Third, they provide James with a severance package that allows him to pursue his dream of starting an educational program for at-risk youth. David raised an eyebrow. "And in exchange?" "In exchange, I don't provide the FBI with evidence of their tax evasion, bribery, intimidation tactics, environmental violations, and what amounts to organized racketeering spanning the better part of 2 decades. Olivia, if you have evidence of federal crimes, I have enough evidence to put Richard Blackstone in prison for 20 years and dissolve his company entirely. But that's not what I want." I leaned forward, my voice growing more intense. "I want them to understand that they've been living in a glass house, throwing stones at everyone around them, and that their perfect little dynasty was always one revelation away from complete collapse." "And James? Have you spoken to him since?" "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "James made it clear that he wants nothing to do with me. I'm not going to force a relationship with someone who feels betrayed by my existence." But that wasn't entirely true. James had sent me one message, 3 days after he'd moved out of our apartment and back into his childhood bedroom at his parents' house. It was brief, devastating, and had played on repeat in my mind ever since. "I understand why you did it. I even understand why you couldn't tell me. But I can't be married to someone who destroys people, even people who deserve it. You became everything I was trying to escape from." David arranged the meeting for the following Friday, in a neutral conference room downtown, where the Blackstone legal team could review my evidence without the home field advantage of their family mansion. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the kind of understated power suit that I hadn't worn in 3 years. Armor from my previous life as Olivia Hartwell, heiress and corporate strategist. Richard entered the conference room like a man walking to his own execution, flanked by lawyers who'd clearly warned him about the strength of my position. His face was haggard, aged by weeks of legal battles and financial uncertainty. Behind him came Michael and David, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. James was not with them. "Mrs. Chen," Richard said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "Or should I say, Ms. Hartwell?" "Olivia is fine," I replied, taking a seat across from them at the polished conference table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Let's skip the pleasantries," his lead attorney interrupted. "We're here because you claim to have evidence that could be damaging to my clients. We're prepared to listen, but we're not prepared to be extorted." I opened my briefcase and removed a single photograph, placing it in the center of the table where everyone could see it clearly. It showed Richard Blackstone shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a downtown restaurant, both of them smiling for the camera like old friends. "This is City Commissioner Frank Rodriguez," I said calmly. "The photo was taken 6 months ago, 3 days after Commissioner Rodriguez voted to approve zoning changes that allowed you to build the Riverside Commercial Complex. The envelope he's holding contains $25,000 in cash." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face had gone pale, and his lawyers were frantically scribbling notes. "This is extortion," one of them said finally. "No," I replied, placing another photo on the table. "This is documentation. This photo shows Michael meeting with known organized crime figure Vincent Torino to discuss labor relations at your construction sites. This one shows David threatening property owner Margaret Simmons into selling her family home for a fraction of its value." I continued laying out photographs, documents, and recorded conversations until the table was covered with evidence of systematic criminal activity spanning years. The Blackstone family's empire wasn't just built on aggressive business practices. It was built on a foundation of federal crimes that could destroy their lives permanently. "What do you want?" Richard asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I reached into my briefcase one final time and removed a single sheet of paper. "I want you to read this message aloud," I said, sliding it across the table. Every word, exactly as written. Richard picked up the paper with shaking hands and read, "Never underestimate the shame that sustains your family.